Hello, everyone, and welcome to Nimonik Insights. I'm Jessica Manhas, your host, and with me is Una Jefferson, who's the expert today. Una is a regulatory analyst with Nimonik. She has a year of experience working in Indonesia in wildfire management, and now she's been working with Nimonik for over a year. She's here today to talk about how the Canadian environmental policy is influenced, or how is it made? Because most people would think that it's actually influenced by the constituents, but how NAFTA, which is just a free trade agreement, can highly influence the environmental policy. She's here to talk about that today. Welcome, Una. Thank you so much for taking time out for this podcast.
Thank you for having me.
So, Una, where does this talk come from? Like, what happened recently that made you think about that we need to make people aware how environmental policy is affected by agreements like NAFTA?
Okay, yeah. So there are two main events that have happened recently that make investor-state dispute resolution, which is contained in Chapter 11 of NAFTA, a very relevant topic for the moment. The first is that NAFTA is currently being renegotiated, and Chapter 11 has definitely been indicated by actors from within Canada and from within the United States that Chapter 11 is on the table. The second is that there was a court ruling from the Federal Court of Canada on May 2nd, which upheld a ruling from the NAFTA tribunal, in which an American company called Bill Kahn, an American concrete company, successfully sued the Canadian government for for hundreds of millions of dollars under Chapter 11 of NAFTA.
Oh, well, that sounds quite a loss for the Canadian government. So what exactly happened that led to Canada losing so much of money to the American company?
So this all started back in the early 2000s. It's been a very long process. This American company, Bilcon, they were looking to set up a basalt quarry, which is a kind of stone used in making concrete. This quarry was going to be in Nova Scotia on the Bay of Fundy, at White Point. And the plan was to have a quarry and a marine terminal and to ship basalt to the United States from this site. And this project underwent a joint federal-provincial environmental impact assessment because it was quite controversial in the community, and there were also concerns about the environmental impacts of the project. And then in 2007, the project was ultimately rejected under the assessment process because it was deemed that it would have a strong negative impact on the environment in the area, and also on the core community values of a community at Digby Neck, which would have been impacted by the project. And
so why did Bilcon? So Bilcon's project was rejected, but yeah. What was their basis of suing the government?
Their basis of suing the government was that basically that the environmental impact assessment, the impact assessment overall had been unfair. And basically that they had been led to believe that they could successfully invest in this project by the Nova Scotia government. So the Nova Scotia government, they had earlier put out a series of policy position statements encouraging mining investment in the province. And so this company, Bilcon, said, you led us to invest, and then you created a significant loss for us by canceling this project. And secondly, they said that the environmental impact assessment was unreasonably harsh. They felt that they had been evaluated on criteria that, first of all, did not have a basis in Canadian law, namely this core community values, I'm putting it in quotes, standard. They felt it was not upheld by Canadian law, and also that it was not routinely applied to domestic investors. So they felt that there was some discrimination at play.
So I think the Canadian government, the environmental impact assessment has been undergoing a lot of changes even there's a new bill for the new environmental impact assessment, which would now be called the impact assessment. We did a podcast a while ago.
We did, yes.
Yes.
This is a follow-up.
Yeah. So if the listeners, if you want to get more information on that, you can go and listen to that podcast, which is available in the list here. So technically, the government wanted to protect the community, but it was outside the scope of the environmental impact assessment. And so Bilcon successfully sued the Canadian government and won hundreds and millions of dollars.
Yes.
All right. And how much money have you lost? How much money has Canada lost to NAFTA?
So far, Canada has come out the worst out of the 3 NAFTA countries. It's kind of interesting because this mechanism for that allows investors to sue governments, it was originally put in place out of concerns for Mexico, because Mexico, I think back in the 30s, they nationalized a lot of foreign oil refineries, and so this was pushed by the United States to prevent investors from having their assets taken by governments. But Canada has come out the worst. I think Canada has lost already somewhere in the area of around $300 million. And this winning would significantly increase that amount. Canada has lost a little over half of the cases that have been brought against it so far. In contrast, the United States has never lost a case.
Oh, wow.
Yes.
Okay.
Although there was a case brought by a Canadian company, TransCanada, against the United States, which was later withdrawn because the Obama administration had canceled the Keystone XL pipeline, and then the Trump government reversed that decision. So we'll never know how that would have turned out.
Okay. Yeah. And how many cases? Is there any ongoing case in Canada right now?
Yes, there are several ongoing cases. One that comes to mind is there is another American company. They're all incorporated in Delaware, funnily enough. This one's called Lone Pine Resources, and they lost access to the rights to do oil and gas exploration in the St. Lawrence because of a 2011 moratorium on fracking that was put in place in Quebec. And so they are currently they're bringing a charge. They're suing the Quebec. They're suing Canada on because of this piece of Quebec policy.
Oh, well, so we hope that when the new impact assessment law comes into force in 2019, that's what we hope if it does, then hopefully it would be a little more broad, and then we would lose less money to NAFTA.
Well, yes, that does seem like it would be one potential benefit of the broadening of scope that has been promised in the Act.
So how does so is it fair to say that because we have been losing money in all these cases, so that all these things would be incorporated into the impact assessment that's coming in 2019, like the potential of losing a case?
I mean, I don't think you can guard against it. One thing that a lot of critics bring up about the this provision in NAFTA is that it impacts on the sovereignty of Canada and other nations to make policy within their own jurisdictions. So some of the cases that are being brought currently, like for example, the example I gave about Quebec, like that's against a piece of legislation, and so it's not only when a government process has been perceived to go outside the bounds of legislation.
So it's NAFTA cannot influence the current legislation, of course, but it can influence future legislation.
Yeah, basically the NAFTA tribunal only has the power to order damages to be paid, but these damages can be very large. And there was one interesting study done on the government of Ontario recently, where through a series of interviews, they found that the risk of investor-state dispute settlement actions being brought through this provision was very much considered by government decision makers as they were considering legislation and policy and regulations, and that it was also sometimes taken into account in decision making. So it is conceivable that this provision would have a kind of a chilling effect on environmental regulation, for example.
Well, that's really good to know. So we had like at least people, we didn't put NAFTA and environmental law on the same plate. We thought of more as independent things, but how NAFTA can influence environmental law and the legislation, it's really interesting to know.
It's also on that point, the greatest proportion of claims that have been made under this provision have been against environmental regulation.
Oh, well, that's really interesting to know. So I hope the listeners today, they have gained a knowledge about how the environmental policy is influenced. Thank you so much, Una, for taking time again. And we will come back soon in the next episode with Una Jefferson on a new update or trending topics, and we will see you soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.